Before I tell this story, tell me which state you're watching from. I've always found it fascinating to know who I'm talking to, especially when it comes to a morning that completely rewired the course of my life. It started like any other workday at the Port of Savannah, where the blasts of ship horns and the smell of marine oil have been the steady heartbeat of my world for the past 20 years. I thought that day would be nothing more than a delayed promotion review, one that everyone knew I had waited long enough to earn. But I was wrong, and that mistake opened a storm they had no idea they were calling down on themselves. I arrived at the conference room 10 minutes early, the way a man does after a lifetime built on punctuality. In my hand was my father's old leather notebook, its cover worn, its corners darkened by sea salt. I didn't bring it to show anything off. I brought it to remind myself how far I'd come from that boy who used to watch his father wipe engine oil off the hull. My father always said every job eventually demands two things: precision and decency. If you can hold on to those, they'll save you when things go bad. I didn't expect that day to be one of the bad ones. CEO Hartman sat at the head of the table, his new polished glasses lying neatly beside his files. He smiled when I walked in, the smile of a man about to say something he believes sounds gracious. I took my seat and set the notebook in front of me, my hand resting on the leather like a quiet hello to my father. The room felt strangely still, filled only by the soft hum of the air conditioner. A few mid-level managers sat on either side, nodding as if pre-congratulating me. Everyone knew this review was little more than a formality. Hartman barely got 3 words out before the door flew open with a bang that made everyone jump. I didn't need to look to know who had walked in. Lydia Hartman, his daughter. Her heels struck the floor like she was walking a runway, not entering a critical company meeting. She wore a tight white suit, the kind meant to project sharpness when knowledge couldn't. And her expression was bright, too bright, the look of someone carrying victory without ever having fought anything real. She didn't apologize. She didn't knock. She didn't ask how far the meeting had gone. She just stopped behind her father's chair, placed one hand on it, and spoke in a voice sharp as a blade but hollow as an empty steel drum. "We don't need your methods anymore." The room went dead silent, and not the polite kind of silence. It was the kind where everyone expects me to explode, to demand who she thought she was, to defend myself, but I said nothing. I looked directly at Lydia, then at her father. Hartman only sighed, the sigh of a man watching his child break something expensive and not knowing how to clean up after her. Lydia marched forward, touched the laptop, and shoved aside the presentation Hartman had prepared as if sweeping away a toy to make room for something she liked more. The screen lit up with a new optimization model she claimed was the future of Harborgate logistics. I stared at the very first chart, and for a second it felt like my blood stopped flowing. There in the corner was a faint tilt of pencil shading, a tiny slanted mark only I would recognize. My father's system for tagging unusual tidal rhythm points. A private symbol I'd only ever seen in his notebook and in the drafts I'd drawn from it. No one else in that room noticed it, only me. And Lydia, though she pretended it was her creation. She launched into her presentation at a speed that made it sound like she was afraid someone might steal the floor. Her phrasing was polished, shiny, full of buzzwords, but empty. To anyone outside the trade, she might have sounded impressive. But to those of us who lived our whole lives along the docks, she looked like someone trying to repaint a ship whose hull was already cracked open. I said nothing the entire time she spoke. Every sentence she delivered made the room heavier. Some managers kept glancing at me, worried, sympathetic even. They thought I would snap. They thought I would argue. They thought I'd fight to defend the system I built. But I only smiled, not a happy smile, not a proud one. It was the smile of a man who finally understands exactly what's happening and is far too tired to waste breath explaining it. Then I spoke, softly enough that it made Lydia pause mid-sentence. Good luck with that system. The room felt stripped of oxygen. I stood, gathered my father's notebook, and buttoned my jacket. Lydia stared at me, confused as to why I wasn't erupting. What she didn't understand was simple. Anyone who's worked by the sea long enough knows one truth. The ocean fears no one, and the truth doesn't need anyone to defend it. I walked out in the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Everyone saw a calm man leaving. They had no idea that with every step I took, I could feel a storm forming right behind me. What I didn't know then was this. They had just pushed themselves into that storm. I walked out of the company building that day with my father's notebook in hand, and out of old instinct, I slowed my steps to steady myself. In moments like that, I always return to my memories, like an instinctive way of finding solid ground before a big wave hits. And my memories always take me back to the Port of Savannah, where I grew up and where I learned nearly everything that carried me through 20 years in this line of work. My father was a marine mechanic. He wasn't an engineer or someone who stood on deck giving orders. He was the man crawling under the belly of a ship, listening to the engine to know what had slipped out of place. He did that heavy work with precision and endurance I've never seen in anyone else. My mother worked as a server at a diner near the docks, carrying trays slick with grease through the nonstop noise of the shipyard. They were not wealthy, but they lived by honest labor, real dignity, and the belief that true worth doesn't come from talking well, but from doing things right. The mornings when my father took me to the docks are still the clearest memories I have. Savannah at sunrise holds a kind of beauty no one can describe unless they've stood there themselves. The sky shifts from deep blue to pale orange, then slowly into gold. Mist drapes across the water like a thin scarf. Ship lights stretch long across the quiet sea. I stood beside my father listening to gulls, to exhausted sailors returning from long journeys, to the steady slap of waves against wooden posts. My father could look at the surface of the water and tell instantly whether the tide was rising or falling. Once, I asked how he knew. He answered simply, "You don't have to be smarter than everyone else. You just have to understand the work better than they do." That sentence became the backbone of my entire career. My father never needed long explanations. He lived the truth of what he said. He understood ships, water, wind, and people. No degrees, no presentations, no fancy terminology. Just experience and observation. The older I got, the more I realized that even the smartest people often lack those two things. The notebook I always carry was his final gift to me. Not a ceremonial one, just an old book he pressed into my hand one long workday afternoon. The cover worn, the pages yellowed, the handwriting tilted. But inside it were all the things he had learned. Seasonal tide patterns, temperaments of different crews, small tricks for loading cargo, and warnings only veterans would recognize. It was like his private map of the trade, and over time, it became my compass. He even noted the day I almost got crushed by a container. I was young then, distracted, blasting radio music loud enough to drown out the crane signals. If Earl hadn't yanked my jacket, that day would have ended very differently. I still remember the look on my father's face when he heard about it. He didn't yell. He didn't scold. He simply wrote one line in his notebook. "Intelligence can't save anyone from a 2-ton container." I never wore headphones again. From moments like that, I learned why I trust reality more than polished words. I've seen too many plans that looked perfect on paper collapse the moment a strong wind blew or a small mechanical error appeared. I've seen people who talk beautifully freeze when faced with problems the average dock worker solves in 2 minutes. And I learned that at the port, truth always wins, quietly, without drama, simply by existing. The people at the Port of Savannah taught me that. They don't talk much. They don't hide emotions behind elegant words, but they know how to pull a heavy container in the rain, handle emergencies at 3 in the morning, and stay steady when the sea gets rough. They taught me how to work with shoulders, with hands, with experience, and with pride. No university teaches that. So when I stood in that conference room this morning, watching Lydia swipe through my slides, I wasn't angry. I just saw someone living in a world I never belonged to. A world of PowerPoint and buzzwords and phrases like optimization and strategy. But out on real docks, nothing replaces practical knowledge. No presentation can guide a ship backward into its berth. And no terminology can save a life when the waves get fierce. I left the room and stepped into the wind as if I were walking back to the docks of my childhood. I thought of my father, my mother, the chilled dawn air, the people who did real work with real hands, and I understood exactly why I stayed calm during that promotion review. I had spent a lifetime standing before waves far larger than anything a boardroom could throw at me. What I carried from the Port of Savannah could never be taken from me by a presentation. And deep down, I knew something else. The people who dismiss real knowledge are usually the first ones swept away when the tide turns. They didn't know that on that morning, but I did. And that memory kept me steady when everything ahead of us began to shake in ways they could not imagine. To understand why that promotion review turned into a disaster, I have to go back to the moment Lydia Hartman arrived at Harbor Gate. She didn't come in like someone looking for a place to prove herself. She came in like someone convinced the world was waiting for her to rearrange it. And from that day on, I started seeing the early signs of a carefully crafted takeover. When Lydia walked into the port coordination room, she looked like she had stepped out of a business magazine. A cream suit so stiff that if you put it next to a container, the container might look softer. Her hair was pulled into a tight bun with not a single strand out of place, as if she were afraid the ocean air would ruin her image. And those high heels belonged on a carpeted hallway, not on a floor that could be slick with oil at any moment. She spoke so fast that anyone hearing her for the first time could only catch a handful of familiar words. Synergy, pipeline, optimization, all the vocabulary of someone fresh out of a crash course in leadership and desperate to prove something. The dock workers out in the yard listened in silence. No one objected, of course, but their eyes said enough. They were used to the sound of cranes and engines, not words that couldn't carry a real weight. The CEO was proud enough to nearly show her off instead of introducing her. She will bring fresh winds to the company, he said. I heard that and knew immediately that the staff would spend months cleaning up those winds. But everything truly began when Lydia came to me. She asked to see the forecasting documents I was working on. No hesitation, no courtesy. She simply walked up and asked. I handed her an older version, the internal one. The real model stayed on my computer, the one I had spent years refining with real experience. While I explained the structure of the simulation, I noticed her eyes were not on the data. They were tracking the handwritten marks I had drawn along the margins. She wasn't observing to understand. She was memorizing. I said nothing. But from that moment on, I stayed alert. And the caution was not wasted. A week later, during the team meeting, Lydia stood in front of a brand new slide deck. The CEO watched his daughter as if witnessing the birth of a technological visionary. I looked at the screen and instantly saw the familiar pencil mark on the corner of the chart. A small, slanted stroke, its curve dipping slightly to the left. My father's notation method, the one I kept as a quiet habit since he passed. I had never shared it with anyone. No one else in the room had any idea what it meant. But I knew, and Lydia knew I knew. She carried on as if everything had come from her own analysis. Her speech was smooth, polished, but so shallow that any technician in the yard could see something was off. The longer I watched, the more certain I became. She wasn't just taking ideas from me. She was taking the most personal parts of how I worked. After the meeting, I went back to my desk and opened my father's notebook to compare. I checked each mark, each curve, each faint line. They matched exactly. It was no longer a suspicion. That evening, I didn't go home. I stayed in the office and transferred my real system onto a separate drive, encrypted and backed up in a way only I could unlock. I didn't hide anything from the company. I simply secured the parts I had developed on my own time and with my own equipment. In this industry, no one understands the boundary between company property and personal expertise better than someone who has worked as long as I have. The next morning, when I walked down to the yard to check shipments, Harris, one of the veteran workers, waved me over. He glanced up at the operations room where Lydia was talking loud enough for her voice to cut through 2 layers of glass. He leaned in and said plainly, "She thinks a port runs on a slide deck, huh?" I laughed. At least the yard still had its sense of humor, even with a storm coming. And through small jokes like that, I realized something. Truth does not need to shout to be real. The people working under the sun, the wind, and the non-stop machinery had always known who had true skill and who only had words. I stayed quiet and observed. The more I watched, the more I understood that Lydia's actions were not accidents. She asked the kinds of questions only someone collecting information would ask. She showed up at the exact moments when my most critical work was in progress. She repeated phrases I had said but twisted them just enough to show she didn't fully understand them. And the CEO believed every word she presented. That was when I understood the game had begun. Years working at the port taught me something. Some waves move silently. Not big, not sudden, but strong enough to flip a ship if you don't notice them in time. Lydia was that kind of wave. Quiet, persistent, corrosive. From that day forward, I separated every piece of real data from the shared system. I built my own private model using the experience I carried, keeping it in places she could not reach. I didn't confront her. I simply held steady and let the truth take care of its own work. I didn't know then that she had already crossed a line. But only a few weeks later, everything would erupt in a way no one at Harbor Gate could have imagined. And when it did, there would be no way back for her. I remember that morning clearly. The air at Harbor Gate felt heavy, the kind of weight you notice right before a storm, though everyone kept pretending it was business as usual. The investors from Stonebridge Capital had arrived early, dressed in sharp suits, walking with the confidence of people used to deciding the fate of hundreds of workers with a single nod. They were here to watch the demonstration of the new optimization system Lydia had boldly promised would change the entire operational chain of the Port of Savannah. I stood at the end of the third-floor hallway, leaning against the glass railing, watching through the doorway into the large conference room. I was not invited, of course. In Lydia's words, the new technology did not need old perspectives. I did not mind. Sometimes standing outside gives you a clearer view than the people seated inside. Lydia walked in first, still completely Lydia. Her hair was pulled into that perfect high bun that made me think she used circus-grade hairspray, a white blazer bright enough to reflect the room lights, and a short skirt just within the dress code, but long enough to signal confidence. She smiled widely, radiating the kind of energy only someone who believes intelligence is a posture, not a skill, could maintain. The funny part was that the investors actually looked impressed. She shook everyone's hand and spoke at the same speed she always used when she was trying to cover gaps in her understanding. The word synergy appeared 3 times in 1 minute. I saw one investor offer a polite smile. He probably did not follow half of what she said, but professional smiles were part of the ritual. CEO Hartman stood near the screen, unable to hide how proud he was. He introduced Lydia as if she had invented a new type of engine. Our forecasting system today represents a significant step forward for Harbor Gate, he said. Lydia will walk you through it. She stepped to the control table, inhaled like a model stepping onto a runway, and opened the first slide. I saw the familiar white and blue color palette she loved. The graphics were impressive, I will give her that. But the problems of this industry have never lived in anything impressive. The beginning of the presentation flowed smoothly enough. Lydia spoke with the polished rhythm of someone who had practiced in front of a mirror for 3 weeks. Technical terms sprinkled evenly. Lines like "as you can see" and "according to our research" slipped in effortlessly. But I knew one thing for certain. She did not understand what she was saying. She was simply repeating it. Then it was time to run the simulation. She pressed the button and the screen shifted to forecasting mode. A map of the port appeared. Data flickered across it, looking believable. For exactly 3 minutes. The tide pattern began shifting, not slightly, so wildly off that if anyone tried to operate based on it, a ship would approach the port at the wrong angle by nearly 20 meters. The wind force chart displayed impossible anomalies, as if the model was inventing weather out of thin air. Warehouse 4 flagged a catastrophic backlog in 15 seconds. Then the container flow simulation jumped from normal rhythm to complete gridlock. An investor in the front row leaned his head to the right, looking at Lydia. Is this an error? Lydia straightened, swallowed hard. No, the system is thinking. Another investor laced his fingers together, tilting his head with a calm patience. Thinking, she nodded, lips trembling slightly. Yes, optimization needs time. From where I stood, I could see her expression cracking. She did not understand that a forecasting system does not think. It runs correctly or it fails. And right now it was failing so badly, the room fell into an awkward, heavy silence. 2 minutes later, the screen froze completely. The numbers are locked at values that could never exist in real life. One investor tapped the laptop gently, maybe hoping it was just a glitch. It was not. Everything was frozen. The simulation shut down entirely, replaced by a blue screen with a single message. System halted. I heard footsteps behind me, and Earl, my old friend, stood beside me with his arms crossed, staring through the glass. He let out a low whistle. This is better than free comedy. I laughed, just a small sound, but a real one. Inside the room, Lydia kept trying to restart the program. CEO Hartman tried to salvage the moment with a few lines. Probably just a minor technical issue. But none of the investors looked convinced. One of them stood, closed his notebook, and said with cold politeness, "We will review our proposal." Then they left the room, one by one, without a single glance at the CEO or Lydia. In that moment, I knew Harborgate had just lost a contract worth exactly the number Lydia once bragged would be our golden turning point. It slipped away in that conference room, quiet as an autumn breeze, except it carried Lydia's reputation with it. Inside the room, Lydia stood frozen. CEO Hartman's face turned red, his hands shaking with anger. They tried to hide it, but anyone who had worked long enough could see it. This was a fall you do not get up from easily. I leaned against the railing and took a slow breath. Not joyful, not just a deep certainty that what happened today was not accidental. It was the inevitable result of building a castle out of presentations instead of real knowledge. Earl patted my shoulder. "You saw this coming, didn't you?" I answered quietly. "Anything that does not belong to the sea will not survive the sea." I walked away from the hallway and down the steel stairs. Each step echoed a steady rhythm that sounded like a warning of something bigger on its way. Not for me, for Harborgate, and this was only the beginning. I walked out of the operations building after that disastrous demo without looking back, not because I felt nothing, but because I knew what had just happened was the natural result of everything that had been piling up for a long time. What I did not expect was that by late afternoon, my phone would buzz with an unfamiliar number. I assumed it was the shipping team or the maintenance crew checking on a morning load. But when a steady, deep voice came through the line, I stopped in place. "Is this Reeves? This is Mason from Stonebridge Capital. We would like to speak with you privately." That single word, privately, made me pause. Investors never ask to meet privately with someone who is no longer part of a company they just watch crumble, unless they have seen something others have not. I asked where they wanted to meet. Mason answered immediately, "Harbor Point Coffee, 15 minutes. I checked the time. They did not give me much room to think, but I did not need much. When I arrived, the place was not busy. A few sailors are arguing over last night's game, the smell of slightly burnt coffee hanging in the air. Mason was already seated, along with another person I recognized instantly. Thompson, the one the finance world called the vein reader. She could look at any operational system and point straight at its weak spot. She never smiled for free, and I had never seen her smile sincerely. I pulled out a chair and sat, keeping the same calm I always carried. Mason began, speaking quietly but clearly. "Reeves, we want to ask directly, what happened this morning? Would you call it an unexpected error, or a system that never truly understood how a port works?" I met his eyes. If a model is built from copying without understanding the roots, collapse is normal. In fact, predictable. Thompson leaned forward onto the table. "Then what is the real system?" I did not circle around it. No model can replace real knowledge. You cannot draw a gust of wind on a slide deck and expect it to blow in the right direction. I built my forecasting model from tides, load weight, crane deviation, wind direction, and a few variables you only understand after a decade on the yard. I paused. I did not share those with Lydia, because that is not knowledge a person can absorb over one lunch meeting. Mason leaned back, deep in thought. Thompson opened a small notebook, flipped a few pages, then looked straight at me. "Can you prove it?" I nodded. I pulled out the old laptop I always carried in my backpack, the one I used to build my private system, untouched by anything Lydia ever accessed. I opened my model, the real one, the complete one, not the diluted version I had shown her. I ran a test. The wind lines appeared exactly as the morning sensors recorded them. The tide patterns smoothed into the precise rhythm. Containers distributed according to load rules, something Lydia had never even asked about. The entire model ran clean, No lag, no freeze, no hesitation. It completed a full forecast cycle in under 4 minutes. Mason looked at Thompson. She gave a single nod. I knew that nod held the weight of a contract. I did not boast or oversell. I simply said, their system runs fast, especially when it collapses. Mason laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind. You should have said that in the conference room. I shrugged. No need. The truth said enough. We talked for nearly half an hour. They asked why I kept my own version. I told them the truth, because I knew there would come a day when real knowledge would be dismissed and replaced by polished presentations. They asked if I was willing to work on a higher level. I said I was always ready for real work, as long as I did not have to spend my time teaching people who thought they understood the trade because they understood a slide deck. Near the end of the meeting, Mason leaned in. Reeves, Lydia does not understand what she is saying, right? I answered softly. I knew the moment she stepped onto the dock for the first time, and you let her use that broken model. I looked him straight in the eye. I did not give her a broken model. I gave her an old one. Using it wrong was her choice. Thompson allowed herself a small smile, the rare kind. The way you let the truth do the work is quite elegant. I smiled back. I grew up on the docks. Nothing elegant about that. Waves break wherever they hit. Mason placed both hands together on the table. Here is the thing, Reeves. Your system, if developed correctly, could become an operational standard for many major ports. We want to explore that possibility. I did not answer immediately. Silence has value on the docks, sometimes more than words. Then Mason asked the most important question of the entire meeting. Would you like to lead a new project? I looked out the window. Outside, the Port of Savannah was wrapped in golden afternoon light. Cranes lowering cargo, ship horns echoing in the distance. A familiar memory surfaced. Standing beside my father, listening to him say that understanding the work is the most important thing. I took a slow breath, feeling something rise within me like a soft tide. And that was when I realized the roles in this game had officially shifted. The meeting ended, but the question hung between us like a doorway to another chapter. A chapter Lydia, CEO Hartman, and Harborgate had no idea they had just opened for me. I stood, shook their hands, and walked out of the cafe knowing one thing clearly. This was not the end. It was only the first step towards something far larger than they were prepared to face. Someone had finally asked me a question no one had ever asked in my entire life. Would you like to lead a new project? I went home after the meeting with Stonebridge Capital, and Mason's question kept echoing in my mind. Would you like to lead a new project? It did not shock me, but it stirred something deep inside me, like someone had just nudged the layer of silt that had settled at the bottom of a quiet channel. I spent the rest of the evening by the window, watching the harbor lights glow against the gray sky. Everything was so still I could hear the clock ticking, each beat sounding like a reminder that a choice was waiting. I had just stood to make another cup of tea when someone knocked on the door. 3 knocks, quick and firm. Not a neighbor, not a delivery driver, the kind of knock from someone who was not used to waiting. I opened the door. Raymond Hartman, the CEO, stood in front of me. For a second, I barely recognized him. The tailored suit he wore every day was wrinkled across the shoulders. His tie had slipped off center. His hair was a mess, the kind of mess that comes from fighting a storm and losing. His eyes were sunken, ringed with steel-colored fatigue, as if he had spent the entire night thinking of only one thing. Collapse, we need to talk, he said. No permission asked, no pause. He walked straight into my home, as if that right still belonged to him. I closed the door and kept a measured distance. Hartman stood in the middle of my living room and dragged a hand over his face. For a CEO like him, that gesture said more than any confession. You know what happened this morning, he began, trying and failing to keep his voice steady. I saw part of it, I answered. Hartman winced. It is not something to joke about. The situation is serious. The investors want answers immediately. Everything is slipping out of our hands, not our hands, I corrected softly. He froze at that. A crack appeared in the tension in his eyes. I am not here to argue semantics, he pushed on. You understand the system better than anyone. You knew Lydia was not ready. You should have supported her. You should have told me. I looked at him and spoke slowly. I did tell you. You only heard what you wanted to hear. Hartman narrowed his eyes. Are you implying you let this happen? I did not sabotage anyone, I said, my voice flat as calm water before a storm. I simply did not work overtime for slides that did not carry my name. This time, he had no quick response. Hartman turned away and paced the room like a man trying to push back rising water with his bare hands. Daniel, you have been with Harborgate for nearly 20 years. I trusted you. I promoted you. You owe this company. I cut him off. I do not owe anyone anything. I did my work, and I did it well. He stopped, facing me again. The power in his eyes was gone. What remained was fear. Stonebridge is pulling out of negotiations, he said quietly. They believe Lydia does not understand the model. They want to speak with you. They think you are the only one who can save us. I sat down and folded my arms. What do you want? I want you back, he said immediately, like he had rehearsed that line since he stepped onto my porch. Fix the system. We will redo the demo. I will acknowledge your contributions publicly. Salary, bonuses, new title, everything is negotiable. I let out a small laugh, just enough to make him frown. I do not need recognition after being ignored, I said, and I do not need a temporary title to patch over someone else's mistake. Hartman stepped closer. Daniel, if this contract collapses, Harborgate will not recover. Hundreds of people will lose their jobs. I will lose the company. Lydia, she chose her path, I said. No one forced her to present something she did not understand. He swallowed hard, then softened his voice into something close to pleading. I know you were treated unfairly, but think of the others. I shook my head. I have been thinking of them for 20 years. Silence fell between us, long and heavy. Hartman stood there as though he had just read a verdict with his own name on the first line. When he spoke again, it was almost a whisper. You are taking their side. Those investors. I stand on the side of the truth, I said. That is what you abandoned when you believed in a polished presentation over the person who understood the work. Hartman clenched his hands. You will regret going against me. I met his eyes. I am not against anyone. But I will not return to clean up a mess someone else created. The night wind swept across the porch, carrying a thin trace of sea salt. Hartman stared at me for a few more seconds, as if hoping I would change my mind. But when he saw my face remain still, he released a long breath, the kind of breath an old ship makes when it gives up its last bit of steam. He turned and walked down the steps. His shadow stretched long under the porch light, so long I wondered if that shadow was the only authority he had left. When he opened his car door, I realized something. His whole life, he had stood on a deck giving orders. For the first time, he realized he no longer had a compass. And as he drove away, I could see the weight on his shoulders was heavier than any container out in the yard. After the night Hartman stood at my door, something inside me went quiet in a way I had never felt before. Not the chaos of someone plotting revenge, but the stillness of a man who finally sees the direction he is meant to go. I no longer felt anchored to Harborgate. It was like stepping off a cramped deck and onto an open beach, letting the wind hit my face without anyone shouting orders. 3 days later, I left Savannah and drove down to Jacksonville, a port city that was neither too loud nor too small, just enough room for me to start over without eyes watching my every move. I rented an old office near the waterfront. High ceiling, scratched glass windows, sea wind slips through cracks in the wall with a soft whistling sound. To anyone else, it was a rundown space. To me, it was freedom. Tide Logic was born in the simplest way possible. One old wooden desk, 3 chairs, and a laptop I had carried for 7 years. But I knew the model would only work if it was built by people who understood one truth. Ports do not run on fashionable buzzwords. They run on real logic and real experience. I hired 3 people. First was Mark, a young programmer whose typing sounded like jazz drumming. Chaotic at first, smooth as a receding tide once you saw the result. He was blunt, but every sentence landed exactly where it needed to. Second was Riley, a software engineer with an energy stronger than the sea wind blowing across the piers. She could work until midnight and still be as alert as if she had slept 8 hours. She loved iced coffee and had no fear of deadlines. And the third was Captain Horace Miller, a retired cargo ship captain with a silver beard and a voice like a foghorn at dawn. He did not know how to write code, but he knew every tide along the eastern coast. I needed the kind of knowledge no textbook could teach. When we shook hands, he said, "I do not like computers." I said, "Good. I need someone who is not dazzled by them." He laughed loudly. Then we are a match. While we were building from nothing, Harbor Gate kept stumbling. News from Savannah rolled in every day. Like waves pounding a rock, no one bothered to inspect for cracks. Morning reports said Harbor Gate delayed cargo handling. Noon updates said Stonebridge demanded a full review of the model. By afternoon, investors paused their strategic talks. The press started calling Harbor Gate the wandering giant. I only shook my head. Not because I was cold, because I had seen this coming from the moment they handed the foundation to someone who had never walked the yard. At Tide Logic, we worked day and night. Mark tuned the algorithms to the tidal flow. Riley built an interface even tired dock workers could navigate. Captain Miller adjusted wind and crane deviation parameters simply by watching the color of the water on the video feed. His method looked rough, but it was accurate enough to leave Mark staring in disbelief. Riley joked, "You adjust wind settings like adjusting a hat." The captain shot back instantly. "A crooked hat looks bad. A crooked port bleeds money." We decided to run our first test at a small port near Fernandina Beach. The portmaster there had once known my father, and he agreed after only two conditions. We would not disrupt operations, and I only needed one day. The test happened on a rare, clear morning. The sea was flat like glass. Mark hit the run button. The tides appeared right on time. The wind direction shifted smoothly. The container simulation flowed perfectly, with not a single misalignment. No lag, no freeze, no error. Captain Miller watched the final frame and said something I will remember as long as I live. "You taught that computer to think like a real captain." I laughed. "I just taught it not to underestimate the sea like people do." He nodded. "That is more than I can say for half the suit wearers I have met." The portmaster signed the approval report in minutes. When I looked at the three signatures on the page, I felt something I had not felt in years. Recognition for what I had quietly built. When we returned to the office, an email from Stonebridge was waiting. One short line: "Prepare for the strategy meeting." Mason added a private note: "The board wants to hear about Tide Logic." I did not cheer. I just leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. Maybe this is what growing up feels like, when happiness does not shout, but rises gently like the night tide. Harbor Gate was not given that privilege. A week later, the headlines hit. Harbor Gate loses South America freight contract. The captain walked into the office carrying a stack of newspapers and dropped them on my desk. "You should frame this page," he said, half teasing, half serious. I shook my head. "I do not need fame." "Nobody said you need it," he replied, "but it proves what you built is real." That afternoon, we ate sandwiches in the office, the classic meal of a low-budget startup. Riley looked at her phone and frowned. "Daniel, word is that Lydia has been missing for 2 days. No one has seen her at Harbor Gate." I paused, not out of shock, but because the timing arrived exactly when I expected it would. When a large ship begins to sink, the first to abandon the deck is usually the one who knows they cannot steer it back. I looked out the window, where the sea reflected the last light of the day, and I understood something. This story was far from over. Harbor Gate was falling, Tide Logic was rising, and Lydia had vanished from everyone's radar just as the next chapter was opening. The night in Jacksonville was so quiet I could hear the wind brushing against the railing outside. I was reviewing the newest simulation Mark and Riley had built, adjusting a few parameters Captain Miller had sent that afternoon, when a knock sounded on the door. Not the firm 3 knocks Hartman used. This one was hesitant, soft, almost like someone unsure whether they should even be standing there. I walked over and opened the door. Lydia stood in front of me. It took half a second for me to recognize her. The blonde hair she always kept perfectly brushed was tangled as if she had run through the ocean wind. Her eyes were red, the dark circles beneath them unmistakable. Her makeup had smeared, and the white blazer that once drew every eye in the conference room was rumpled, like she had been sitting in a car for hours, twisting it in her hands. She did not speak at first. She just stood there, gripping the handles of her bag, her shoulders trembling. "Daniel," she whispered, so quietly I had to lean in to catch it. I did not know where else to go. I opened the door wider. Come in. She stepped inside and sank onto the sofa like someone who had walked miles without rest. I poured her a glass of water and set it in front of her. Lydia stared at it for a long time before she finally spoke. They fired me. The words fell into the living room like a stone dropping into still water. No shouting, no crying, just a truth laid bare. I expected that to happen, I said. Not harshly, just a fact. Lydia let out a bitter laugh, the kind aimed at herself, not at anyone else. You were right. They do not need me anymore. My father, he would not look at me. Not a word. He just shut his office door. She wiped her face, but the tears kept coming. I thought I was good. I thought I could make him proud. I thought if I presented well enough and used the right words, I would be the one to bring the company into a new age. I stayed silent. She continued, her voice breaking in pieces. The investors laughed at me in front of the CEO. The employees sighed. Even the PR team would not make eye contact. I have never been looked at that way. I sat across from her and rested my hands on my knees. Lydia, you are smart, but you believe the world runs on slides and impressive phrases. You thought the tide would change direction because you drew a new arrow, but everything out there follows its own rules. It does not care who you are. Her breath hitched. I know. A tear fell onto the back of her hand. I never understood anything. Not the wind, not the tide, not how a port really works. I only borrowed other people's knowledge. Yours. Her voice shook when she said it. Daniel, I am sorry. I looked at her. No anger, no rush to forgive. Just seeing her as she was now. The woman who once stood in a conference room in a bright blazer with a confident smile, now curled into herself like a child who had fallen for the first time. You did not hurt me, I said slowly. You only hurt yourself. Lydia bowed her head, clutching the glass until her knuckles turned pale. My father called me a disappointment. He said I damaged the company's reputation. He said I ruined our family name. I have never heard him speak to me like that. She trembled. My whole life, I just tried to please him. I never knew what the real world looked like. I never learned that some things take sweat to understand. I never did hard work. Never stood on a yard at 3 in the morning. Never watched the wind shift. Never learned any rule outside what was taught in a presentation class. I leaned back. You are not a bad person, Lydia. You just lived too far from reality. She looked up. Are you angry with me? I was angry, I said, but anger burns out. The truth handled the rest. She blinked a few times, then gave a small, sad smile. I thought you would yell at me or shut the door on me. I do not make a habit of kicking people who have already fallen, I said, especially when they know why they fell. She nodded, her shoulders sinking. Daniel, I have nothing left. My job is gone. My name is ruined. My father, he does not see me as his daughter anymore. I do not know where to begin. I watched her carefully before answering. No one can run a port with slide decks, and no one rebuilds a life through one night of effort. But you have one thing many people never have. What is that? She asked, her eyes swollen. You see the problem? She went still, like those words took the air from her lungs. From here on, I said, every step has to be real. No borrowing, no taking shortcuts, no pretending to understand. The real world is wide, Lydia, and the only person who can keep you out of it is you. She wiped her face and took a deliberate breath. Not a strong one, but the kind that marks the first moment someone finally understands the truth. Thank you, Daniel, she whispered. I just needed to hear that from someone who does not hate me. I never hated you, I said. I only felt sorry for you. She lowered her head, her hands twisting together. I will go. I do not want to bother you any longer. She stood, straightened her clothes, and wiped her face. At the doorway, she paused for a moment. If one day I finally understand the real world, I hope I can work like a normal person, not like some character out of a slide deck. You can, I said, if you start today. Lydia gave a faint but genuine smile, then stepped down the porch and disappeared into the Jacksonville night. I watched her go, not to make sure she was safe, but because I knew tonight would change her. The door closed behind me, and the room returned to silence. But this silence was different. It carried the feeling that something was shifting. She walked away, and by the next morning, everything changed. The next morning, Jacksonville greeted me with a pale gold sunrise stretching across the water. The waves tapped against the shore like they were knocking on the door of a new day, and the sky was so clear I could see every line of light reflected on the windows of the Tide Logic office. I arrived earlier than usual, and before I could make coffee, Mark came running out with an expression caught between excitement and panic. "Daniel," Mason called. "Urgent but good. Very good." I had not even asked when my phone buzzed. It was Mason. "Reeves," he said, his voice bright enough to sound like someone who had just won a perfect baseball bet. "The board met last night. We reviewed the Fernandina trial. We want to invest immediately." I leaned against the railing, listening to the waves below. "You mean funding? 18 million for the first round," he said plainly. "If everything continues well, the second round will double that." I did not smile, but something inside me opened like an old wooden door pushed wide by the wind. Tide Logic, the thing that began with an old office, 3 chairs, and a quiet dream, was about to become something that could touch the world. When I returned to the office, everyone was gathered around the whiteboard, caught between celebration and disbelief. Captain Miller was squinting through his reading glasses at the contract Mark had printed, while Riley hopped in the corner like a kid unwrapping a holiday gift. "So the sea has accepted us," the captain said. "The sea accepts real work," I answered. And from that day on, Tide Logic entered a new stage. We moved into a larger office near the port. Clear glass walls, polished concrete floors, and a meeting room where the sea wind could not slip through. More engineers applied. More former dock workers came offering real-world data. One afternoon, while reviewing the new applicants, I saw a familiar name. Noah, the young engineer at Harborgate, once dismissed for not fitting their culture. I hired him on the spot. On his first day, I handed him a small box. "Keep this," I said. Noah opened it, and his eyes widened when he saw my father's old notebook. The one filled with 3 decades of handwritten notes on wind, tides, and ship approach angles from the Port of Savannah. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I kept it for 20 years, I said. "Now it is your turn. Only one rule. Write things as they are. Do not polish them." He held that notebook like it were a treasure. In a world racing toward digital perfection, an old notebook sometimes carried more weight than any algorithm. Then the important day arrived. Reeves version 1, the first full working model I had built over 20 years, was tested at Brunswick, one of the biggest ports in the region. The port was packed with containers. Ship horns echoed like distant drums. I stood in the observation tower with the port master and Stonebridge representatives. On the ground, containers were lifted in the precise sequence the system calculated, not guided by luck, but by real data. The system ran, no error, no lag, not a single false alert. When the screen displayed the words "optimal route complete," the port master gave my shoulder a firm tap. "Daniel, this is going to change how we work for the next decade," Stonebridge nodded, "and you will lead it." I took a long breath and looked at the sea stretching out before us. At last, I had taken what I understood best, the rhythm of ports and water and wind, and built it into a system that honored those truths. A week later, while I was reviewing a new optimization model for the Central America routes, the office door swung open. Earl stood there. He still wore the same protective gear, his cap tilted slightly to the left. Only his eyes had changed. Lighter, brighter, no longer weighed down the way they were the day I left Harborgate. "You really did it," he said. "I only did what I was meant to do," I replied. Earl stepped forward and offered his hand, the hand of a man who had pulled heavy cables under blazing heat. "I want to work with you again." "Harborgate is not Harborgate anymore." I took his hand. That handshake was not a promise or an apology. It was like two workers meeting after a long storm, each having lost something, but having found something more important in return. "Tide Logic will always have room for someone who understands real work," I said. Earl nodded, his eyes turning red. "Feels like coming home." That evening, I stood by the window of our new office, watching the sea stretch wide beneath a lavender sunset. The Brunswick port moved steadily in the distance. Inside, the sound of keyboards mixed with soft laughter and the smell of coffee. I opened a new notebook Noah had given me. the one he was beginning to write in. His handwriting was young, but the careful notes made me smile. My father would have been proud. I sat down and wrote a few lines on the first page. Justice does not always need noise. It only needs the truth to stand firm. A light breeze slipped through the cracked window and turned the page. I looked out at the water one last time before turning off the lights. Tomorrow would bring new waves, new wind, and new work. And if you are still listening, I have one question for you. If you believe in quiet justice and in workers who rise through skill and grit, then subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories to tell. Thank you for your time.